What if I told you that two of the oldest stories ever told about the origins of black people, one from the Bible, the other passed down through generations in Africa, tell different tales? One story traces the line of humanity back to a single pair of first humans, while the other speaks of diverse ancient tribes whose roots stretch back to the dawn of time itself. You might think they align, but when you dig deeper, you'll discover that these stories don't fit as neatly together as we're often taught. In fact, the biblical account of black origins and the rich oral traditions of Africa have more contradictions than most of us realize. Why does this matter? And what can it teach us about the very nature of history, culture, and identity? Let's dive in. The story of human origins is one of the oldest and most powerful narratives we have. It's a tale that has been passed down in many forms, from ancient texts to oral traditions, each shaping the way we understand who we are. The Bible, one of the most influential texts in history, offers a version of this story that spans thousands of years. In Genesis, the Bible introduces us to Adam and Eve, the first humans, who were created by God in the Garden of Eden. From them came the generations that would eventually populate the earth. It's a straightforward story, one that places all humanity in the same lineage, regardless of race, and offers a foundation for how we view the beginning of human civilization. However, the Bible doesn't just talk about the beginning of humanity in abstract terms. It also traces the specific lineages of different people, like the descendants of Noah after the flood. This is where things get interesting for the story of black origins. According to the Bible, Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Each son's descendants are said to have settled in different regions of the world. Ham, often associated with the African continent, is considered the ancestor of many African nations, including Egypt, Kush, modern-day Sudan, and Canaan. In this context, the Bible lays out a foundation for what many believe to be the origin of African peoples. But here's the twist. While the Bible presents this genealogy, it does so through a very specific lens, one that reflects the worldview and priorities of the time in which it was written. The genealogies in the Bible were never meant to be complete or fully scientific in the way we think of historical records today. Instead, they served theological and cultural purposes, reinforcing a particular understanding of the world and humanity's place in it. African oral traditions, on the other hand, tell a different kind of story. Passed down through generations, these stories are rich in symbolism, memory, and cultural identity. Unlike the Bible's written record, oral traditions evolve with the people telling them, adapting to new contexts and preserving ancient wisdom. They don't just trace bloodlines or territorial conquests. They embody the spiritual and cultural journeys of entire communities. These stories paint a picture of a people who have long understood their connection to the land, the ancestors, and the divine in a way that is deeply tied to their everyday lives. In many African cultures, creation stories are not just about the beginning of humanity, but about the ongoing relationship between people and the world around them. These traditions speak of gods and spirits, heroes and ancestors who shaped the land and its people. Some traditions trace the origins of black people back to a time long before the biblical creation story, with origins deeply rooted in Africa's diverse landscapes, from the deserts of the north to the jungles of the central and southern regions. These stories are not about one man or one woman, but about the collective, the community, and the land itself. The differences between these traditions and the Bible's story of origins reveal something powerful about the nature of history, culture, and memory. So when we look at the origins of black people through both the biblical lens and the lens of African oral tradition, we find two stories that overlap in some ways and diverge in others. The Bible's account, with its focus on genealogy and divine will, offers a framework that has shaped the way many view the beginning of humanity. African oral traditions, on the other hand, offer a deeper, more complex view of origins, one that is bound to the land, the people, and the divine. And yet, both stories speak to the same fundamental question: where do we come from? And what does that tell us about who we are today? In the next sections, we'll explore the differences and similarities between these two accounts, diving into the specifics of the biblical story, the richness of African oral history, and what they each reveal about our shared past. The biblical account of human origins begins with the creation of the world in Genesis, where God speaks everything into existence, from light to land, animals, and finally, humanity. In Genesis 1:26, God says, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness." And thus, the first humans, Adam and Eve, are created. According to this narrative, Adam is the first man, the progenitor of all humans, from whom all races and nations eventually descend. The Bible presents humanity as a unified family, originating from this one pair, and the message is clear: all people are brothers and sisters in the eyes of God. However, the story doesn't end with Adam and Eve. Their descendants spread across the earth after the fall, after they ate the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden. This moment set in motion the unfolding of human history, marked by both the potential for great good and the capacity for immense evil. Yet, it's in the story of Noah and his 3 sons that we begin to see a more direct connection to the African continent. After the Great Flood, which wiped out much of the world, Noah and his family are tasked with repopulating the earth. Genesis 9:18-19 explains that the descendants of Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, were the ancestors of all the nations of the earth. Ham, the son often associated with Africa, is said to have had 4 sons: Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. These names are traditionally linked to regions in Africa and the Near East. Cush is often considered to represent Nubia or modern-day Sudan. Mizraim is associated with Egypt, Put with regions in North Africa, and Canaan with the lands around modern-day Israel and Lebanon. It is through these descendants that many African nations are believed to have originated. This portion of the Bible, often referred to as the Table of Nations, is crucial in understanding how the Bible connects black peoples to their biblical ancestry, framing Ham's line as central to the peopling of Africa. However, this biblical genealogy is not just a record of ancient families. It serves a theological purpose. For the biblical writers, the focus is not on establishing a strictly historical account of the rise of nations, but on showing the divine ordering of the world. In this worldview, the nations that emerge from Noah's sons are divinely appointed, each given a role in God's plan for humanity. The people of Africa, according to this narrative, are seen as part of God's greater design. Though the details of their journey, what these nations achieved or how they lived, are not deeply explored in the Bible. The Bible doesn't provide much about the culture, history, or spiritual practices of these nations. Instead, it focuses more on their interactions with Israel and their roles in the larger narrative of salvation history. For example, the Egyptians, descendants of Mizraim, are pivotal in the story of the Exodus, when the Israelites are freed from slavery. Cush, Ethiopia, and Egypt are often mentioned in the Old Testament as powerful nations, but there is very little focus on the richness of their societies or how they shaped the world beyond their interactions with the Israelites. In a sense, the Bible's treatment of Africa and its people is more functional than descriptive. The narrative presents African nations as part of the larger divine plan, but does not dive deeply into the specific history or legacy of these people. For those who view the Bible as the definitive account of human history, this can create a limited and sometimes reductive view of African origins. African peoples are connected to the Bible through their genealogical ties to Noah, but the full breadth of their ancient history, culture, and contributions to civilization is often overlooked or minimized. This gap in the narrative is where African oral traditions offer something profoundly different. While the Bible presents a genealogy rooted in divine plan and structure, African oral traditions offer a much richer, more detailed picture of the people, their land, and their divine connections. Where the Bible traces lineages in a linear fashion, African oral histories weave stories that embody the complex relationship between people and the cosmos, gods, and ancestors. These stories, told and retold over generations, hold within them the spirit of a people's identity, their triumphs and their struggles. The difference between the Bible's genealogical approach and the narrative style of African oral history highlights not just a difference in storytelling, but a difference in worldview. The Bible offers an account that centers on one lineage, Adam and his descendants, whereas African oral traditions are far more diverse, considering the existence of multiple kingdoms, gods, and ancestral lines that interweave to form a collective history. This sets the stage for understanding the broader cultural and theological questions that arise when we compare the Bible's account with African oral histories. Both offer valuable insights into the origins of Black peoples, but the way they present those origins and the stories they tell are vastly different. This brings us to the deeper question: can these two narratives coexist? And what happens when we explore their intersections? African oral traditions, unlike the Bible's written genealogies, are dynamic, deeply rooted in culture, and profoundly tied to the land. These traditions have been passed down through generations, not through written texts, but through storytelling, music, dance, and rituals. They serve not only as historical records, but as living expressions of identity, spirituality, and community. The oral history of Africa is vast and diverse, encompassing thousands of languages, tribes, and regions, each with its own creation story, its own understanding of human origins, and its own connection to the divine. In many African cultures, creation stories are not about a single event in the past, but are woven into the very fabric of daily life. These stories explain not just where people came from, but why they exist, how they relate to the land, and how they interact with the gods and ancestors. Some traditions speak of the first humans being molded from the earth, directly connecting the people to the land they inhabit. For instance, among the Dogon people of Mali, creation myths speak of a divine creator god, Amma, who formed the first humans from the clay of the earth. This connection to the land is fundamental, as it ties identity to geography and heritage to the very soil beneath one's feet. Unlike the Bible, where the earth is created for humanity's use, African oral traditions often emphasize a mutual relationship between humans and nature, where people are stewards of the land rather than its dominators. Some African creation myths center around the idea of a cosmic struggle or a divine journey. Among the Yoruba people of West Africa, for example, the deity Olodumare, through his servant Orunmila, sent a spiritual leader, Obatala, to create the earth. But before doing so, Obatala had to confront various forces, a reminder that creation is often not a singular act, but a process of overcoming obstacles and challenges. The richness of these stories lies in their complexity, offering not just a foundation of human origins, but also a map of the moral and spiritual journey that humanity must undergo to understand their place in the world. In contrast to the biblical narrative, which is linear and focused on a singular human family, African oral traditions are often far more inclusive. They don't just trace human origins back to one couple or one tribe, but rather see humanity as a collection of stories that span time, space, and spirit. The ancestors play a crucial role in these stories, as they are not just remembered, but actively present in the lives of the living. The living and the dead are intimately connected, and the oral tradition is a way of honoring this connection. It is not just about history, it is about identity, culture, and belonging. The ancestral stories speak of migrations, struggles, triumphs, and sacred knowledge passed down through the ages, forming the backbone of community life. Many African cultures also have creation myths that are deeply intertwined with the forces of nature. For the Zulu people, the first humans emerged from the ground, and their connection to the earth was vital to their survival. Similarly, the Maasai people of East Africa have a creation story that centers around the god Enkai, who gave them cattle and taught them how to live in harmony with the land. These stories speak of a people who understand their role in a broader natural order, where the land is not just a resource, but a sacred gift that must be respected and cared for. The importance of these oral histories cannot be overstated. Unlike written records, which can be altered or lost over time, African oral traditions are fluid, evolving with each generation, but always rooted in the core beliefs and values of the people. They are not just stories. They are the lifeblood of African cultures, constantly being reinterpreted and reaffirmed. Each telling of the story is an opportunity to reinforce cultural values, to remind the people of their shared history, and to pass on wisdom to the younger generations. One of the most significant differences between African oral traditions and the biblical account is the role of the community. In the Bible, human origins are often portrayed in terms of individual or family lineages, focusing on the actions of a few key figures like Adam, Noah, and their descendants. African oral traditions, however, emphasize the collective. They tell stories of tribes, kingdoms, and communities coming together, sharing in the common task of living in balance with the world. This collective approach highlights the importance of community identity, where no single person or family is seen as more important than the group as a whole. These oral histories also hold the keys to understanding the values and worldviews of African peoples. They are not just stories about the past. They are moral guides, teaching lessons about how to live justly, how to honor the ancestors, and how to live in harmony with nature and the divine. In many cases, these stories are deeply spiritual, with gods and deities playing active roles in human affairs. In this sense, African oral traditions offer a holistic view of human origins, one that incorporates spiritual, social, and environmental dimensions. The depth and richness of these traditions stand in contrast to the more straightforward genealogical approach of the Bible, which offers a linear and somewhat simplified version of human origins. While the Bible focuses on a single family tree, African oral traditions present a more complex, multifaceted view of the world, where the past is alive in the present, and the stories of the ancestors continue to shape the lives of the living. In this way, African oral histories offer a fuller, more nuanced understanding of human origins, one that acknowledges the interconnectedness of people, land, and the divine. The difference between the Bible's written account and African oral traditions extends beyond content. It's also about how each tradition was preserved and passed down through time. The Bible, as a written document, provides a static account that can be referenced, interpreted, and translated into countless languages. Its stories are set in ink, allowing them to be preserved across generations without alteration. This has its advantages. There's a certain permanence to written texts, but there's also a limitation. Once something is written down, it's fixed. It's harder for a written text to evolve or adapt over time to changing circumstances. In contrast, African oral traditions are not bound by the restrictions of paper or ink. Instead, they thrive on fluidity, adaptability, and the community's engagement with the story. In oral traditions, the stories are told, retold, and reshaped by each storyteller. Every new telling of the story is an opportunity to emphasize different lessons, add new details, or adjust the narrative to reflect contemporary concerns. This means that while the core elements of the story, like creation, ancestors, or moral values, remain constant, the way these stories are expressed can shift over time. This gives oral traditions a flexibility that written texts lack. The stories are alive, constantly evolving, and they are shaped by the people who tell them. The storyteller has a dynamic role, engaging the audience and even modifying the story to suit the moment. This flexibility makes oral traditions an incredibly powerful way of preserving culture, as they can adapt to new social, political, or spiritual circumstances. Oral traditions also carry a level of intimacy and community connection that written texts don't always provide. The Bible, while central to Christianity and powerful in its influence, is often studied alone or in group settings where interpretation is guided by clergy or scholars. The written text, while accessible, doesn't always foster the same kind of personal, communal engagement as oral storytelling does. In many African cultures, storytelling is a social event. It's done in the village square, around a fire, or at family gatherings, where people sit together, listen, and participate. The audience is not just passive. They interact with the storyteller, ask questions, and sometimes even contribute to the narrative. This participatory element creates a deep sense of belonging and shared experience. Everyone is involved in the story, and the act of storytelling becomes a ritual of reaffirming identity, values, and cultural heritage. The flexibility of oral traditions also means that they can carry wisdom from the past and apply it to the present. In African communities, stories about creation, morality, or the adventures of ancestors are often filled with practical lessons for everyday life. These lessons are not just abstract teachings. They're meant to be applied directly to the challenges people face. A story about a heroic ancestor might not only teach about courage, but also offer guidance on how to handle personal struggles or community conflicts. This direct relevance to contemporary life is one of the reasons why oral traditions have remained such an enduring part of African cultures. They are not just a link to the past, but a living guide for the present. In contrast, the Bible's genealogical accounts, especially in the Old Testament, are often more focused on historical events and divine actions. While the Bible certainly contains moral lessons and spiritual guidance, its narratives are less adaptable in the same way that African oral stories are. The biblical genealogies, for example, are often set in the context of a divine plan, God's purpose unfolding through specific individuals or nations. They are historical records, but they are less engaged with the everyday lives of ordinary people. The Bible's genealogies and creation stories are not meant to be retold with every new generation, but to be understood and interpreted through a theological lens. The story is told once, and it becomes a foundational text that shapes religious practice and belief. This distinction between oral and written traditions is key when we consider why these two different accounts of Black origins diverge. The Bible's genealogical framework is static, passed down through written texts that remain largely the same. In contrast, African oral traditions are malleable and constantly evolving, shaped by the communities that tell them. Both offer valuable insights into the origins of Black people, but they do so in fundamentally different ways, one through a fixed written record, and the other through a living, breathing process of storytelling that adapts to the people, their needs, and their experiences. What's fascinating is that these two different methods of preserving history, the Bible's written word and Africa's oral traditions, complement each other in many ways. While the Bible provides a universal framework, linking humanity through the lineage of Adam and Noah, African oral traditions offer the richness of diversity, placing greater emphasis on community, the land, and the spiritual relationship between people and the divine. Together, these two forms of storytelling can create a fuller, more holistic understanding of Black origins, one that acknowledges both the shared and unique elements of the human experience. When we explore the geography of the biblical narrative, we find that place names and regions play a significant role in connecting the Bible's story to the African continent. The genealogies in Genesis, particularly those of Ham, provide clues about the connection between the descendants of Noah and various lands in Africa. The descendants of Ham, whose line includes Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan, are associated with regions that, according to the Bible, are located in Africa or its nearby territories. Cush, for example, is often considered to represent Nubia, or the region we now associate with modern-day Sudan. The ancient kingdom of Cush, one of Africa's earliest civilizations, is believed to have been a significant and powerful kingdom, long before the rise of Egypt. In the Bible, Cush is frequently mentioned in the context of mighty nations, with figures such as the Cushite king or warriors playing key roles. This direct link between the biblical account and real-world African kingdoms gives credence to the idea that the Bible's genealogies are deeply connected to African origins. Mizraim, another son of Ham, is traditionally linked with Egypt. The Bible's references to Egypt are among its most prominent, considering Egypt's significant role in the Exodus story, where the Israelites are enslaved before their miraculous deliverance by Moses. Egypt, one of the oldest civilizations in human history, is closely associated with the lineage of Ham in the Bible, emphasizing the deep connection between African heritage and biblical prophecy. The Bible speaks of Egypt as a land of both great power and spiritual significance, a place of both oppression and deliverance, with a direct tie to the descendants of Ham. Put, another son of Ham, is associated with regions in North Africa. In some interpretations, this can refer to the ancient Libyan tribes or regions further west, while others consider it to relate to parts of the coastal areas of North Africa. The Bible's mention of Put as a part of Ham's descendants further strengthens the connection between biblical genealogies and the African continent, though much less is said about this region compared to Egypt or Cush. Canaan, the fourth son of Ham, is historically significant as well, as the descendants of Canaan are said to inhabit the land later known as Israel and surrounding regions. Though this is not part of Africa in the strictest geographic sense, it still lies on the borderlands of Africa and Asia, demonstrating that the ancient biblical view of African peoples extended beyond the continent itself. Canaan's descendants are important not only in the history of the Israelites, but also in the broader narrative of the Old Testament, particularly in the context of the conquest of the Promised Land. The Bible doesn't just list names and places, it places these nations within a divine narrative. The connection between these geographical locations and the descendants of Noah's sons provides a framework for understanding the African diaspora within a biblical context. Africa, in the Bible, is not just a distant land, it is an integral part of the unfolding story of humanity. While the Bible's treatment of Africa and its people is often seen as secondary to the main narrative of Israel, these references give an indication that the African continent was viewed as a place of both great history and divine purpose. When we look at African oral traditions, we find a similar emphasis on the connection between people and the land. African cultures have long understood that their identity is deeply tied to the geography they inhabit. In many African traditions, creation stories describe how the land and its people are interconnected, and how the ancestors' spirits live within the earth, the rivers, and the trees. This deep spiritual connection to the land is central to many African cultures, and it mirrors the way the Bible connects certain regions with divine purpose. African oral traditions are filled with references to specific lands, tribes, and ancestral territories. These geographical references are not just markers on a map, but are imbued with cultural and spiritual meaning. For example, the Yoruba people of West Africa have a rich tradition of linking their ancestors to specific lands, which are believed to be sacred and spiritually significant. Similarly, the Zulu people of South Africa trace their origins back to the land, viewing it as a source of power and identity. The shared theme of land and heritage, both in the Bible and in African oral traditions, highlights the importance of geography in understanding human origins. The Bible's connection to Africa, through the descendants of Ham and their associated regions, is mirrored in the African worldview, which places great significance on the land as a source of life, identity, and spiritual connection. Both traditions understand that human origins are not just about the people, but also about the land they come from, reinforcing the idea that geography shapes culture, history, and spirituality. These geographical connections also provide an important framework for understanding the diversity of the African continent. The Bible's references to Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan demonstrate that the ancient African world was far from monolithic. There were diverse nations, peoples, and cultures, each with its own unique contributions to human history. African oral traditions, with their vast array of stories and myths, further highlight this diversity, showcasing how different peoples within Africa have distinct origins, customs, and beliefs. In the end, the geography of the Bible, when compared to the rich and diverse landscape of African oral traditions, reveals a complex relationship between land, people, and identity. Both the Bible and African oral traditions offer insights into the ancient world, connecting human beings to the earth in ways that transcend mere physical geography. Through these stories, we see that the roots of humanity are deeply intertwined with the land, with each piece of soil holding the stories of those who have walked upon it. And in this way, both the Bible's genealogies and African oral traditions help us understand the foundational relationship between people and the world around them. The divergence between the biblical account and African oral traditions creates a unique challenge for anyone seeking to understand the full story of Black origins. On one hand, the Bible presents a linear, structured genealogy, tracing human history back to Adam and his descendants, offering a divine framework through which to interpret the origins of various nations, including those in Africa. On the other hand, African oral traditions provide a much more complex, fluid, and community-focused narrative, one that emphasizes the collective history and spiritual connection between people and their land. This disparity raises a crucial question. How do we reconcile these two narratives? Can they coexist, or must one be seen as more accurate than the other? The challenge here isn't just theological or historical. It's also deeply personal. For many African-descended peoples, the Bible has been a central text, shaping not only religious beliefs but also cultural identities. However, African oral traditions hold a profound place in the heart of many communities, offering a sense of connection to their ancestors and the land long before the Bible entered their lives. The tension between these two stories, one rooted in written scripture and the other in oral memory, has created a conflict that's not easily resolved. The Bible's account of black origins, particularly through the descendants of Ham, can feel limiting or overly simplistic when viewed through the lens of African history. African oral traditions, with their deep ties to specific regions, gods, and ancestral figures, offer a much richer and more nuanced view of the past. The challenge, then, is to find a way to honor both traditions, recognizing the value of the Bible's genealogies, while also embracing the depth and complexity of African oral history. This isn't just about reconciling two different accounts. It's about appreciating what each story offers in its own right, and understanding that they both contribute to the larger narrative of human origins. The problem also lies in the way these stories have been used and interpreted throughout history. The Bible's genealogies, particularly those linking Ham to Africa, have been historically misused to justify racial hierarchies, slavery, and colonialism. The so-called curse of Ham has been distorted and manipulated to support the oppression of African peoples, falsely framing the descendants of Ham as cursed or inferior. This misinterpretation of the Bible has left a lasting impact on how African people relate to their biblical heritage. It has created a sense of disconnection, as the Bible's account has been weaponized against them for centuries. On the other hand, African oral traditions have often been dismissed or minimized by outsiders, particularly during the colonial period, which sought to undermine indigenous African knowledge and cultural practices. Oral traditions were frequently viewed as inferior to written history, seen as myths or superstitions, rather than legitimate historical accounts. This dismissal of African oral history has led to a sense of erasure, as the rich and diverse histories of African peoples have been marginalized or ignored. The challenge, then, is to break free from these historical biases and explore these two narratives on their own terms. It's not about picking one over the other or declaring one account as more true than the other. Rather, it's about finding a way to honor both traditions and understand how they can coexist, each shedding light on different aspects of Black origins and identity. For African-descended peoples, this means reclaiming the Bible as a text that can be read with an understanding of its historical context, while also embracing the wisdom and significance of their own ancestral stories. It means recognizing the importance of oral history in preserving cultural identity, while also acknowledging the spiritual and theological insights that the Bible offers. One way to approach this challenge is to understand that the Bible and African oral traditions are not necessarily in competition, but rather complement each other. The Bible's account of human origins may be more focused on genealogy and divine plan, but it doesn't erase the richness of African history and culture. Similarly, African oral traditions may be more rooted in the land and the community, but they also reflect universal themes of creation, struggle, and spiritual connection. By viewing these two stories not as competing narratives, but as complementary pieces of a larger puzzle, we can begin to appreciate the complexity of Black origins and the diverse ways in which they have been understood across time and space. The problem, ultimately, is not whether the biblical account or the African oral tradition is correct. It's how we choose to understand and interpret these stories in a way that respects both traditions. This requires moving beyond the limitations of Western historical and theological frameworks, which have often sought to categorize and compartmentalize different cultural and religious beliefs. Instead, it involves embracing a more holistic approach that recognizes the value of both written scripture and oral memory, allowing them to inform and enrich our understanding of the past. As we continue to explore the tension between these two narratives, it's important to remember that the goal isn't to find a right answer, but to engage with these stories in a way that acknowledges their power, their relevance, and their deep connection to the identities of Black people across the world. The historical layers of interpretation that surround both the biblical account and African oral traditions reveal much about the ways in which these narratives have been shaped, manipulated, and understood over time. The relationship between the Bible and African heritage has always been complex, often marked by tension, appropriation, and reinterpretation. As these stories have passed through different hands, whether missionaries, colonial authorities, or African theologians, their meanings have evolved. The stories themselves, however, remain as vital as ever, holding powerful lessons about identity, faith, and the struggle for belonging. When European missionaries first arrived in Africa, the Bible was often presented as the ultimate authority on history, culture, and faith. Many African communities were introduced to Christianity as a part of the colonial project, and the Bible became a tool for both evangelism and control. In this context, the biblical narrative of human origins, particularly the story of Ham and his descendants, was frequently used to justify the hierarchical racial systems that were imposed upon African peoples. The curse of Ham, a misinterpretation of the Bible, became a central justification for slavery and racial discrimination, suggesting that the descendants of Ham were somehow marked for servitude. This theological distortion of the Bible had a profound impact on how African peoples viewed themselves in relation to both the Bible and their own cultural heritage. For many, the Bible was seen as a symbol of oppression, and the Black identity was often framed in negative terms, tied to the curse of Ham, or the idea of being outside the divine plan. This created a complicated relationship with Christianity, as African people were often told that they needed to reject their ancestral practices and embrace a foreign religion in order to be saved. However, as African societies began to reclaim their identity and resist colonial oppression, a new wave of African theologians and scholars started to reinterpret the Bible in ways that resonated more deeply with African culture and history. Figures such as Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, and the influential African theologian and scholar, John Mbiti, began to explore ways in which African spirituality and Christianity could coexist without abandoning African identity. They argued that the Bible's teachings could be understood in the context of African traditions, and that the story of Black people in the Bible could be seen as one of empowerment, not subjugation. In the wake of the independence movements across Africa, there was a renewed focus on reclaiming African oral traditions as legitimate sources of knowledge and wisdom. These traditions, long dismissed by Western scholars as primitive or mythical, were recognized as rich, complex systems of understanding the world. African scholars and cultural leaders emphasized the importance of oral history in preserving African identities, and in many communities, there was a renewed interest in connecting with ancestral stories, rituals, and cultural practices that had been suppressed during colonial rule. This shift in perspective was not just about reclaiming African heritage, it was also about reinterpreting the relationship between Africa and the Bible. African Christians began to read the Bible through the lens of their own cultural and spiritual experiences. This process of reinterpreting the Bible was not an attempt to dismiss it, but rather to reclaim it as a tool of liberation, a text that could be understood in ways that aligned with African values and experiences. The Bible was seen as a text that could speak to the struggles of African people, offering messages of hope, resistance, and divine justice in the face of oppression. In modern times, The reinterpretation of the Bible in Africa continues, as African theologians and scholars explore how Christianity intersects with indigenous African beliefs. African Christianity is not a monolithic faith. It is a dynamic, evolving tradition that integrates elements of both the biblical narrative and African oral traditions. For example, many African Christian communities emphasize the importance of ancestors and spiritual leaders, recognizing that these figures play a vital role in the lives of believers. This approach is not a rejection of the Bible, but a recognition that African spirituality can coexist with Christian beliefs, providing a richer, more holistic understanding of the divine. This ongoing reinterpretation of the Bible is essential to understanding the relationship between African oral traditions and the written scripture. It shows that these two forms of storytelling are not mutually exclusive, but rather complementary. African oral traditions provide a deep, spiritual connection to the land and the ancestors, while the Bible offers a framework for understanding the divine will and purpose in the world. Together, they offer a fuller picture of Black identity, one that encompasses both the spiritual richness of African cultures and the transformative power of Christian faith. The historical layers of interpretation also highlight the ways in which African people have continuously resisted the erasure of their cultural heritage. For centuries, colonial powers sought to replace African traditions with Western ideals and Christian doctrines. But African people have always found ways to retain and adapt their ancestral stories. Today, the blending of African oral traditions with Christianity continues to shape the way that Black people understand their place in the world and their relationship with the divine. This ongoing process of interpretation and reinterpretation reminds us that the stories we tell about our origins are not static. They evolve, they shift, and they adapt to the needs of the time. Just as African oral traditions have evolved over centuries to meet the changing realities of African peoples, the Bible too can be reinterpreted to speak to the struggles, hopes, and dreams of the modern world. In this way, both the Bible and African oral traditions continue to offer powerful insights into the story of Black people, providing a narrative that is as complex, diverse, and evolving as the people it seeks to describe. As we explore the reasons behind the differences between the Bible's account of Black origins and African oral traditions, several factors come to light that help us understand why these stories diverge and how they reflect the different cultural, spiritual, and historical contexts in which they were told. One key reason for the difference is the nature of the sources themselves: written scripture versus oral storytelling. The Bible, being a written text, was recorded in a specific historical context, often by individuals or groups seeking to preserve theological and moral teachings. African oral traditions, on the other hand, are deeply rooted in the lived experiences of the people, often passed down through generations by storytellers, elders, and griots, and are shaped by the dynamics of community, migration, and adaptation to changing circumstances. The Bible's account of human origins is shaped by the ancient Near Eastern worldview, which saw history as divinely ordained, unfolding through specific genealogies and divine interventions. The genealogies in the Bible are intended to establish a clear, linear connection between key figures in salvation history, such as Adam, Noah, and the sons of Noah. The genealogical framework emphasizes the idea of a chosen lineage and focuses on the role of specific individuals in fulfilling God's plan for the world. This theological emphasis on divine destiny and providence has shaped the way the Bible connects Black people to their ancient ancestors through the descendants of Ham, whose lineage is often viewed in the Bible as part of a broader divine plan. African oral traditions, in contrast, were not written down as part of a single, cohesive theological system. They are instead grounded in the daily lives of the people, reflecting their interactions with the land, the spirits, and their ancestors. These stories were told in community settings, often as a means of teaching moral lessons, preserving cultural practices, and strengthening social bonds. As a result, African oral traditions tend to be more flexible, adaptable, and less focused on establishing a singular divine framework for the origins of humanity. Instead, they emphasize the importance of community, the land, and the interconnectedness of all living things. Another factor that explains the difference is the historical context in which these narratives were shaped. The Bible's account of Black origins was written in a context where the Israelites were establishing themselves as a distinct people with a specific relationship to God. The genealogies in the Bible were intended to help define and solidify this identity, making it clear that the Israelites were the chosen people in God's plan for salvation. While the Bible acknowledges the existence of other nations, such as Egypt and Cush, it primarily focuses on the story of Israel's covenant with God, which makes it somewhat limited in its portrayal of the diversity of human origins. In contrast, African oral traditions were shaped by a much broader and more diverse array of cultural influences spanning the entire African continent. These traditions reflect the experiences of different peoples, regions, and spiritual systems, and they often contain multiple layers of meaning that reflect the richness and complexity of African identity. African oral traditions are deeply tied to the specific lands and environments in which they were told, and they often incorporate elements of nature, animal symbolism, and spiritual beliefs that are not present in the biblical narrative. In many African cultures, the spiritual connection to the land and the ancestors is central, and the stories told reflect the understanding that humanity's origins are intimately connected to the earth itself. The geographical diversity of Africa also plays a significant role in the differences between the two traditions. Africa is a vast continent, home to hundreds of distinct cultures, languages, and spiritual beliefs. Each community has its own creation stories, reflecting the unique experiences and histories of its people. African oral traditions are not limited to a single narrative or geographical region. Instead, they encompass a wide range of stories that reflect the diverse environments in which people live. From the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Central Africa, African oral traditions have evolved to reflect the specific realities of each environment, and they often include gods, spirits, and beings that are tied to the land itself. In contrast, the Bible presents a more centralized account of human origins, with a focus on the Near East and the journey of one specific family through history. While the Bible acknowledges the existence of other nations, such as Egypt and Cush, it does not provide the same level of detail or complexity regarding the diverse cultures and peoples of Africa. The Bible's account of Black origins, therefore, can feel somewhat limited when compared to the vast and varied oral traditions of Africa, which embrace a broader, more diverse understanding of humanity's relationship to the divine and the earth. The role of colonialism also contributed to the development of these two distinct narratives. During the colonial era, African cultures were subjected to the forces of European imperialism, which sought to suppress indigenous traditions and replace them with Western ideas of history, religion, and identity. The Bible, brought to Africa by European missionaries, became a tool of colonization, often used to justify the domination and subjugation of African peoples. In many cases, African oral traditions were dismissed as primitive or superstitious, and their value was undermined in favor of written scripture. This created a deep disconnect between African people and their own cultural heritage, as their oral histories were devalued in favor of a foreign religious text. However, in recent decades, there has been a resurgence of interest in African oral traditions, as many African scholars and spiritual leaders have worked to reclaim these stories and reinterpret them in light of the African experience. African theologians, for example, have sought to reconcile the teachings of the Bible with the spiritual wisdom found in African oral traditions, creating a new kind of African Christianity that draws on both sources of knowledge. This process of reconciliation has allowed African people to reclaim their identity, to honor their ancestors, and to reframe the biblical narrative in a way that reflects their own spiritual and cultural values. In this light, the differences between the Bible and African oral traditions can be seen as opportunities for growth and deeper understanding. Instead of viewing these traditions as opposing forces, they can be seen as complementary ways of understanding the world, one rooted in written scripture and divine revelation, the other rooted in oral storytelling and ancestral wisdom. By embracing both, we can gain a more complete picture of Black origins, one that honors the richness and complexity of African history, while also acknowledging the theological and spiritual insights offered by the Bible. The challenge, then, is not to choose between the two, but to find a way to bring them together, allowing both stories to speak to the unique experiences and struggles of Black people today. The relationship between the Bible and African oral traditions takes on even greater significance when we consider the historical context of slavery, identity, and the struggle for freedom. For many Black people, particularly in the context of the transatlantic slave trade, the Bible became a tool of both oppression and liberation. Slave owners used biblical narratives to justify their exploitation of African slaves, often citing verses that emphasized submission, obedience, and the supposed curse of Ham. Yet, at the same time, the Bible also served as a source of spiritual strength for enslaved Africans, offering hope, resilience, and the promise of freedom through stories of deliverance, redemption, and divine justice. In the Americas, enslaved Africans faced brutal conditions that stripped them of their freedom, their culture, and their identity. Many were forced to abandon their ancestral beliefs and adopt Christianity, often under duress. The Bible, with its stories of suffering, exile, and eventual liberation, resonated deeply with African slaves who saw parallels between their own plight and the stories of the Israelites' enslavement in Egypt. The Exodus story, in particular, became a powerful symbol of resistance, offering a vision of freedom from oppression and the hope of a promised land. This narrative of divine deliverance played a central role in the religious life of African slaves, who found solace in the idea that God had not forgotten them, and that they, too, could be liberated from their chains. At the same time, African oral traditions, which had long been central to the cultural and spiritual life of African peoples, became even more important as a means of preserving identity and resisting the erasure of culture during slavery. Enslaved Africans would often draw upon their oral histories and ancestral knowledge as a way of maintaining a connection to their heritage, even as they were forcibly separated from their homes and families. These oral traditions became acts of cultural defiance, keeping alive the stories of their ancestors and the wisdom that had been passed down through generations. One of the most important aspects of African oral traditions during this time was their ability to adapt and survive under oppressive conditions. Enslaved Africans blended their African spiritual practices with Christianity, creating a unique form of resistance that allowed them to honor their ancestors while also embracing the message of salvation. This syncretism, fusing African deities and spiritual practices with Christian beliefs, was a way of holding on to cultural identity in the face of overwhelming odds. In this context, The Bible's narrative of freedom and justice was often interpreted through an African lens, where the struggle for liberation was not just about physical freedom, but also about spiritual and cultural redemption. The impact of slavery on African identity was profound, as it forced Black people to grapple with questions of worth, identity, and belonging. The forced separation from their cultural roots, the stripping away of their language and customs, and the constant dehumanization they experienced created a deep sense of loss and disconnection. In the face of this, both the Bible and African oral traditions offered different ways of reclaiming dignity and purpose. The Bible, with its message of redemption and the equality of all people before God, was a source of strength, offering the possibility of spiritual freedom, even in the midst of physical bondage. African oral traditions, with their emphasis on ancestral wisdom, community, and connection to the land, provided a sense of continuity, helping enslaved Africans maintain a sense of cultural identity and belonging. The power of these narratives, both biblical and African, was evident in the ways they shaped the resistance movements of enslaved peoples. The Bible's message of freedom and justice was a rallying cry for those seeking to break free from the chains of slavery, while African oral traditions provided the foundation for a spiritual and cultural rebellion against the forces of oppression. Together, these traditions created a framework for understanding the struggle for freedom, one that was rooted in both spiritual salvation and cultural resilience. After emancipation, the connection between African Americans and their cultural and religious heritage remained central to the formation of Black identity. The African American Church, in particular, became a powerful institution, blending African spiritual practices with Christianity, creating a unique form of worship and community. This syncretic approach to faith helped African Americans reclaim their identity and strength, using the Bible not as a tool of oppression, but as a source of empowerment. African oral traditions, too, remained vital, as stories of the ancestors, the wisdom of elders, and the importance of community continued to guide the lives of African Americans. The legacy of both the Bible and African oral traditions in the struggle for Black identity and freedom continues to be felt today. For many, these two traditions are not in opposition to each other, but rather work together to form a comprehensive understanding of Black history, spirituality, and culture. The Bible offers a framework for understanding the divine and human struggle for justice, while African oral traditions provide a deep connection to the land, the ancestors, and the communal values that have sustained Black people throughout history. In the face of systemic racism, economic inequality, and social injustice, the stories of deliverance, resistance, and liberation found in both the Bible and African oral traditions continue to inspire and empower Black communities. They serve as reminders that no matter the challenges faced, Black people have a rich history of resilience, strength, and divine purpose. And the Bible and African oral traditions together offer a narrative of hope and redemption, one that transcends the hardships of the past and points toward a future where justice and equality prevail. Linguistic and cultural clues provide another layer of insight into the differences and similarities between the biblical account of Black origins and African oral traditions. Language, after all, is the vehicle through which stories, histories, and identities are passed down through generations, and it offers powerful clues about the connections between ancient peoples, their migration patterns, and their cultural practices. Both the Bible and African oral traditions make use of language to connect their people to the past, but they do so in different ways, shaped by the historical contexts in which these narratives were constructed. The Bible, in its genealogies, provides a framework for understanding human origins through names and place names. The names of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, are not just labels. They carry deep cultural and linguistic significance. The name Ham, for instance, has been associated with the African continent for centuries, and many of the biblical references to his descendants, particularly Cush, often linked to Nubia or Sudan, are tied to Africa. The etymology of these names, along with their associated regions, provides linguistic clues to how the ancient Israelites viewed the world and the peoples within it. These names, passed down through generations, help to preserve an understanding of the geographical and cultural connections between the ancient Near East and Africa. In addition, the language of the Bible itself provides a window into the cultural and spiritual worldview of the ancient Hebrews. The Hebrew Bible, with its rich poetic and metaphorical language, emphasizes concepts such as covenant, chosen people, and divine intervention, ideas that have had a profound impact on Christian and Jewish thought. While the Bible offers a framework for understanding human origins in the context of divine history, it also provides a spiritual and theological language that shapes how we understand human identity and destiny. For African readers, the language of the Bible can either resonate deeply with their own experiences or, at times, feel foreign and disconnected from their cultural heritage. In African oral traditions, language plays an equally important role in preserving history and culture, but in a more fluid, dynamic way. African languages are incredibly diverse, with thousands of distinct languages and dialects spoken across the continent. Each language carries with it a rich history, encapsulating the unique experiences, values, and spiritual beliefs of the people who speak it. The names of places, gods, and ancestors in African oral traditions are often deeply connected to the land itself. In many African cultures, the act of naming is sacred. Names carry power, and they are chosen with great care because they are believed to reflect the essence of a person or place. The oral traditions of African peoples often include intricate linguistic systems that reflect the spiritual and cultural importance of names. For example, in the Yoruba tradition, names are often given based on the circumstances of a child's birth or the aspirations for their future. These names serve as a reminder of the child's connection to the divine, the ancestors, and the community. Similarly, in the Akan tradition, names are given based on the day of the week a person is born, and these names are believed to carry spiritual significance. This deep connection between language and identity reflects the African worldview, in which language is not just a tool for communication, but a means of connecting to the divine and the ancestral world. In addition to the significance of names, African oral traditions are rich in linguistic devices such as proverbs, songs, and riddles, all of which carry profound cultural meaning. These forms of communication help to preserve historical narratives, moral teachings, and spiritual wisdom. In many African communities, storytelling is not just about recounting past events. It is about teaching lessons, reinforcing social norms, and ensuring that the community's values are passed down to future generations. The use of language in African oral traditions is deeply interconnected with community identity, as the stories told in these traditions are not just individual experiences, but collective memories that bind the community together. One of the most fascinating aspects of the linguistic overlap between the Bible and African oral traditions is the way in which language has been used to reinterpret both sets of stories. For African Christians, the Bible is often read through the lens of African languages, which can provide new meanings and interpretations of the text. For example, in some African languages, the word for God carries connotations that emphasize the divinity's connection to the land and to nature. Ideas that are deeply rooted in African spiritual traditions. This allows for a more integrated understanding of the Bible's message, one that resonates with the lived experiences of African people, who have long seen the divine as present in the natural world. At the same time, African oral traditions, when translated into written forms or incorporated into Christian practices, can offer insights into the ways African people have interpreted the Bible. In many cases, African Christian communities have blended elements of their indigenous beliefs with Christianity, creating a unique form of spiritual expression that reflects both the Bible's teachings and African cultural values. This blending of languages, stories, and religious practices allows African people to reclaim ownership over their own spiritual narratives, integrating the Bible into a broader cultural context, while also honoring the wisdom and traditions passed down through the generations. The linguistic connection between the Bible's genealogies and African oral traditions also highlights the shared history and common struggles of Black people across the world. From the African diaspora in the Americas to the African continent itself, the language used to tell stories of human origins, divine purpose, and liberation serves as a powerful tool for connection. Whether through the biblical names of the sons of Noah or the rich, complex languages of African oral traditions, language helps to preserve the legacy of Black identity, creating a bridge between the past and present. The stories told in both the Bible and African oral traditions, though different in form, reflect the same universal themes of struggle, hope, and redemption that continue to shape Black communities today. Faith and culture are deeply intertwined, and the tension between the biblical account of human origins and African oral traditions often highlights the complex relationship between spirituality, identity, and belonging. For many Black Christians, the Bible represents both a spiritual foundation and a cultural framework. It offers a guide to understanding God's will, the purpose of humanity, and how to live a righteous life. Yet, the story of Black origins within the Bible, particularly through the figure of Ham, has often been interpreted in ways that have led to the marginalization of African people. The theological framework provided by the Bible has, at times, been used to justify slavery, racism, and colonization. But in contrast, African oral traditions have always emphasized a direct and deeply personal connection to the divine, viewing faith and culture as inseparable. This rich spiritual and cultural heritage has often been sidelined or misunderstood in favor of a more westernized view of religion, leading to a tension that still exists today. In modern African Christianity, however, there has been a movement to reconcile these two worlds, faith rooted in the Bible and cultural identity rooted in African spiritual traditions. This reconciliation process has created a space where Black Christians can embrace both their heritage and their faith, allowing them to see the Bible through a lens that honors their ancestors and their cultural history. African theologians, scholars, and pastors have been working for decades to reinterpret the Bible's teachings in a way that resonates with African traditions, using indigenous African concepts to make sense of the Christian message. This allows for a deeper connection to the Bible, as it's seen not as something foreign or forced upon African people, but as a part of their spiritual journey, integrated into their unique cultural context. For example, many African Christian communities emphasize the role of ancestors in their spiritual lives, viewing them as intermediaries between the living and the divine. While this practice may seem at odds with the traditional Christian rejection of ancestor worship, it is a way of honoring the past and acknowledging the wisdom passed down through generations. African Christianity does not always see this as a conflict, but as a natural extension of the Bible's message of honoring one's elders and maintaining a connection with those who have gone before. It's an acknowledgement that the stories of ancestors, whether told through oral traditions or written scripture, are an essential part of understanding God's work in the world. The spiritual journey within African oral traditions also teaches a deep sense of interconnectedness between people, land, ancestors, and the divine. This interconnectedness is often reflected in the understanding of the universe as a harmonious whole, where each element plays a vital role in sustaining life. This view of the world contrasts with the individualism often present in Western interpretations of Christianity, where faith is frequently seen as a personal relationship between the believer and God. For many African Christians, faith is not just a personal journey, but a communal one, where the entire community's well-being and spiritual health are interconnected. In African traditions, the collective is just as important as the individual, and this belief is now being integrated into African Christianity, creating a model of faith that is both individual and communal. This communal aspect of faith also reflects the Bible's teachings about the body of Christ. The idea that all believers are part of a larger community, united in their faith and purpose. By embracing this collective aspect of Christianity, African Christians have been able to create a faith practice that is deeply rooted in both biblical teachings and African cultural values. This allows for a more holistic and inclusive spirituality, one that transcends the tension between the Bible's narrative and African traditions, and instead finds unity in the shared experience of faith. The importance of community in African oral traditions also extends to the role of spirituality in everyday life. African traditions often teach that the divine is present not just in religious rituals, but in all aspects of life: family, work, relationships, and nature. This holistic view of faith is now being incorporated into African Christianity, where everyday life is seen as an opportunity to experience the divine. In this way, faith is not confined to church services or sacred texts, but is woven into the fabric of daily existence. The Bible, when understood in this way, becomes a guide for how to live in harmony with the world, rather than just a set of rules to follow. This integration of African oral traditions with Christian teachings has allowed for a more authentic expression of faith in many African communities. Rather than viewing African spirituality as something to be rejected or replaced by Christianity, many African Christians see their traditional beliefs as complementary to their faith. By honoring both the Bible and African cultural traditions, African Christians are able to create a spiritual practice that is rich, diverse, and deeply connected to their heritage. However, this process of integration has not been without its challenges. There are still tensions within some Christian communities regarding the acceptance of African spiritual practices, particularly when they appear to conflict with traditional biblical teachings. Some conservative factions within the church continue to view African spiritual practices as incompatible with Christianity, leading to divisions within the faith. These divisions reflect a broader struggle within African societies to reconcile the forces of modernization, colonial history, and indigenous traditions with the influx of foreign religious ideologies. Despite these challenges, the movement to reclaim African spiritual identity within Christianity continues to grow. African theologians and religious leaders are challenging the idea that Christianity must be understood through a Western lens, arguing instead that it should be reinterpreted in ways that honor African culture, history, and spirituality. This growing movement is a testament to the resilience of African people who have continued to forge new paths of faith, even in the face of historical adversity. In the end, The intersection of faith and culture in African Christianity offers a model for how to reconcile seemingly disparate narratives. By honoring both the Bible and African oral traditions, Black Christians can create a faith that is truly their own, a faith that is rooted in the wisdom of their ancestors, the teachings of the Bible, and the unique cultural values that have shaped their communities. This process of reconciliation, while ongoing, represents a powerful testament to the enduring strength of African identity and the ability of faith to adapt and grow in response to the needs of the people. The convergence of biblical teachings and African oral traditions leads to powerful lessons that can be applied today, especially when considering the value of both heritage and faith in understanding personal identity, the divine, and community. One of the most profound lessons we learn from these two narratives is the importance of resilience and the power of overcoming adversity. Throughout both the Bible and African oral traditions, the themes of struggle, perseverance, and redemption are recurrent. Whether it's the story of the Israelites' deliverance from Egypt or the journey of African peoples through slavery and colonialism, these narratives teach that hardship is not the final word. Instead, there is always a greater story unfolding, one of freedom, renewal, and divine justice. In the Bible, stories of God's deliverance are everywhere. From the Exodus to the coming of Jesus Christ, the message is clear. Even in the darkest times, God is at work, bringing about change and transformation. For African people, these stories have resonated deeply, particularly in times of oppression. The message that God hears the cries of the oppressed and acts on their behalf has been a source of hope and strength. African slaves, in particular, found comfort in the story of the Israelites, seeing their own struggle mirrored in the biblical narrative. Just as God liberated the Israelites from Egypt, so too could God deliver them from the chains of slavery. African oral traditions carry a similar message of resilience, but the way this resilience is framed is more community-centered. In many African cultures, survival and triumph are seen not as the result of individual effort, but as a collective accomplishment. The elders, the ancestors, and the community play a central role in helping individuals navigate hardship. It's not just about surviving on your own. It's about surviving together, with the strength of your ancestors and your community behind you. This communal resilience can be seen in the way African peoples have endured centuries of oppression, maintaining their cultural identity, spiritual practices, and sense of unity through even the most challenging circumstances. This collective strength is something that can be applied to contemporary struggles as well. In a world that often emphasizes individualism and personal achievement, African oral traditions remind us of the importance of community and mutual support. Whether it's in the context of family, neighborhood, or nation, the idea that we are stronger together is an essential lesson. The Bible also teaches this, particularly in the New Testament, where the church is described as the body of Christ, each member playing a vital role in the collective well-being. This idea of interconnectedness is powerful, especially when confronting modern challenges, from systemic injustice to personal difficulties. The strength of the community can help to overcome obstacles that might seem insurmountable when faced alone. Another key lesson from both the Bible and African oral traditions is the importance of remembering the past. In the Bible, God repeatedly calls the Israelites to remember their history, to recall the times they were delivered from hardship, to pass on the stories of their ancestors to future generations. This is not simply for the sake of nostalgia, but to remind the people of God's faithfulness and to help them navigate the present with wisdom. African oral traditions similarly emphasize the importance of remembering the ancestors, learning from their struggles, and honoring their wisdom. By remembering the past, Both the Bible and African traditions teach us that we gain the strength to face the future. Without this connection to history, we risk losing sight of the lessons that can guide us through modern challenges. This focus on history also shapes how identity is understood. Both the Bible and African oral traditions offer a sense of identity that is not just personal, but communal and historical. In the Bible, identity is often framed in relation to God's covenant and the divine plan for the people of Israel. Identity is both a gift and a responsibility. Individuals are called to live out God's purposes within a larger narrative. Similarly, African oral traditions emphasize that individual identity is rooted in the community, the ancestors, and the land. A person's name, their role in society, and their connection to the land all shape their identity. This understanding of identity, shaped by both history and community, can be incredibly empowering, particularly in a world where personal identity is often fragmented or influenced by external pressures. The Bible's portrayal of a chosen people can also be reconciled with African views of communal identity. While the Bible speaks of Israel as the chosen people, African oral traditions speak of the importance of the people and the land, an entire community being called to carry forward the spiritual and cultural legacy of their ancestors. The notion of being chosen doesn't imply superiority over others, but a special relationship with the divine that comes with responsibility and service. This resonates with African spirituality, where the ancestors are revered as guiding forces who help shape the destiny of the people. In both traditions, the understanding of identity is deeply tied to a sense of purpose and responsibility, both to the divine and to the community. In addition to lessons about community and identity, another important lesson from both the Bible and African oral traditions is the importance of spirituality in everyday life. The Bible emphasizes the need to worship God in all aspects of life, not just in formal rituals, but in the way we live, work, and interact with others. Similarly, African traditions view spirituality as something that permeates every aspect of life, from the relationships within families to the ways in which people relate to the land and the natural world. This holistic view of spirituality reminds us that faith is not just something that happens on Sundays or during designated worship times. It is something that shapes the way we live our lives every day. This connection between faith and daily life also teaches the value of living with intention. Both the Bible and African oral traditions emphasize that life is not random or disconnected, but is part of a greater plan or purpose. In the Bible, this purpose is tied to the will of God, and for African traditions, it is linked to the ancestral spirits and the land. Both traditions encourage individuals to live with awareness of their role in the larger story of creation, to be mindful of their actions, and to strive to live in a way that honors both the divine and the community. This emphasis on intentional living is a reminder that our actions have meaning, and the choices we make every day can contribute to a larger purpose. Ultimately, the lessons from both the Bible and African oral traditions provide a framework for understanding the world that emphasizes resilience, community, history, identity, and spirituality. These teachings offer profound insights into how we can navigate life's challenges, how we can build meaningful connections with others, and how we can live in harmony with the divine. In a world that often feels fragmented and disconnected, these traditions remind us of the importance of remembering where we come from, honoring our shared history, and living intentionally with a sense of purpose. Whether through the stories of the Bible or the wisdom of African ancestors, the lessons we learn from both traditions continue to shape who we are and how we approach the world today. As we conclude our exploration of the differences and similarities between the Bible's account of Black origins and African oral traditions, it's clear that both hold invaluable insights into the human experience. They offer distinct but complementary perspectives on the divine, human identity, and the collective journey through history. The Bible provides a framework for understanding humanity's relationship with God, emphasizing faith, covenant, and divine intervention. It connects Black origins to the divine narrative through genealogies that trace back to the sons of Noah, particularly Ham, whose descendants are associated with Africa. At the same time, African oral traditions offer a vibrant and diverse tapestry of stories that connect people to their land, ancestors, and gods, teaching resilience, community, and spiritual interconnectedness. Both traditions invite us to reflect on our place in the world and our connection to something larger than ourselves, whether that be the divine plan outlined in the Bible or the wisdom passed down through generations in African oral history. The Bible's linear, genealogical account provides a sense of divine purpose, while African oral traditions remind us of the importance of community, shared history, and the spiritual bond with the earth. Both narratives speak to the central human quest for meaning, belonging, and identity. In today's world, where questions of identity and belonging are ever present, these two stories, biblical and African, offer profound lessons. They remind us that our roots are not solely defined by one narrative or one perspective, but by a collection of stories, histories, and cultures that have shaped who we are. Embracing both the Bible's teachings and African oral traditions allows us to appreciate the complexity of Black origins and offers a richer, more nuanced understanding of history and identity. The Bible and African oral traditions also highlight the importance of remembering the past, whether through the genealogies of the Bible or the oral histories of African peoples. These traditions show us that history is not something to be forgotten or disregarded, but something that must be remembered, honored, and passed down to future generations. By remembering the struggles, triumphs, and wisdom of our ancestors, we gain the strength to face the challenges of the present and the future. Moreover, both traditions encourage us to live lives of intentionality, to recognize that our actions matter and that we are part of a larger story. The Bible calls us to live in a way that reflects God's will, while African oral traditions remind us to live in harmony with our ancestors and the natural world. Together, these teachings offer a holistic approach to life, one that integrates spirituality, community, and personal responsibility. As we reflect on these stories, we also recognize the power of reclaiming our own narratives. For many African-descended peoples, particularly in the context of the African diaspora, both the Bible and African oral traditions offer paths to reclaiming identity, dignity, and purpose. They are not opposing forces, but complementary threads in the broader fabric of Black history. By reclaiming both, we affirm the richness of our cultural and spiritual heritage, while also embracing the transformative power of faith. In the end, the stories of Black origins in both the Bible and African oral traditions offer timeless wisdom. They teach us about struggle and perseverance, about the importance of community and collective identity, and about our relationship with the divine. By embracing these stories, we find strength, inspiration, and guidance for the journey ahead, one that honors the past, navigates the present, and looks toward a future shaped by hope, faith, and resilience. In conclusion, the exploration of Black origins through the Bible and African oral traditions reveals not only the rich diversity of human history, but also the profound spiritual and cultural connections that shape Black identity. Both traditions, though different in form and content, offer essential insights into the journey of humanity, providing guidance, strength, and resilience in the face of adversity. The biblical narrative connects Black origins to a divine plan, placing the descendants of Ham as integral parts of God's creation story, while African oral traditions emphasize the significance of community, ancestral wisdom, and spiritual connection to the land. Together, these stories weave a complex, multifaceted picture of human identity, rooted in both divine purpose and cultural heritage. As we move forward, it is crucial to honor both traditions, not as opposing forces, but as complementary paths that enrich our understanding of ourselves and our place in the world. The Bible's teachings about faith, justice, and divine intervention can be integrated with the African view of interconnectedness, communal strength, and spiritual resilience. By doing so, we can build a more inclusive, holistic narrative that honors the past, embraces the present, and shapes the future. Both the Bible and African oral traditions call us to remember our roots, to live intentionally, and to recognize the power of our shared history. In today's world, where questions of identity and belonging continue to be central to the experience of Black people, embracing these two traditions offers an opportunity for deeper connection, understanding, and healing. By integrating the divine message of the Bible with the ancestral wisdom of African oral traditions, we can find new ways to navigate the complexities of modern life while staying rooted in the values that have sustained generations before us. The lessons of resilience, faith, community, and remembrance are just as relevant now as they were in ancient times, and they continue to guide us on our journey toward a more just, compassionate, and spiritually connected future. As we reflect on the deep connections between the Bible's story and African oral traditions, it's clear that these narratives offer timeless wisdom and guidance. Both provide a framework for understanding who we are, where we come from, and where we are headed. If you found this exploration meaningful, I encourage you to continue on this journey of discovery. Dive deeper into both traditions and see how they can enrich your life and faith today. Be sure to watch the next video for more insights on how these stories shape our identity and spiritual path.